Florence, Italy, the autumn of 2009. For 9 years, I've held everything together, keeping our business and lives going, and at the same time, caring for my soulmate as he deconstructs piece by piece into the world of Alzheimer's. I'm in Florence on my first real respite break in 9 years of caring for him. As an artist, I'm enthralled and inspired, rubbing shoulders with the masterpieces of this great city. As a foodie, I'm in hog heaven. Then one afternoon, the elegant curves of a Renaissance church beckon me across the threshold. I enter quietly and find an empty pew to sit, to drink in the hush of this sacred space, a space filled with the curls of frankincense, whispers of rosaries, and centuries of devotion. Without warning, tears of grief sting my eyes and hijack this precious time of respite. This grief stays with me for the rest of the trip. Over and over again, I try to right myself with all the things I have to be grateful for, that I'm here in Italy, living a long-held dream, that I've been well-loved, that my soulmate and I found each other 26 years ago. But these reminders are in vain. There's only this pain and these tears. There are over 44 million people worldwide with Alzheimer's and related dementias, and unless a cure is found, that number can triple by 2050. Along with the afflicted, there are 3 times that number of unpaid caregivers, like I was. Mostly we hear about the disease and how it devastates the person with it. But caregivers suffer as much, if not more, caring for a loved one whose brain seems to be using a foreign operating system that doesn't match with ours. Now, you may think this isn't going to happen to you or your family, but it's estimated that 1 in 9 Americans over the age of 65 has Alzheimer's. It's even more prevalent in Western Europe. That means that in a room like this with 350 plus people, if we were all over 65, 40 of us would have that terminal disease, and 120 of us would be family or friend caregivers to someone with Alzheimer's. That's huge. That's almost half this room. It's an avalanche of an impending epidemic as we baby boomers age. My husband Bob and I felt that we were living our dream life. We'd been in Bali for 10 years. We had fulfilling lives. We traveled, and we were still madly in love even after 14 years of marriage. So when Alzheimer's entered our world, I struggled to cope as my husband, my business partner, and my friend lost his short-term memory and his ability to problem solve and be rational. As the disease progressed, he could no longer speak coherently. He became incontinent. He lost compassion for others. Because of our deep love, I vowed to keep him with me as long as possible and to give him the best life possible. That vow was often tested. One of a caregiver's biggest fears is that the person with Alzheimer's will wander and get lost. And more than 60% of Alzheimer's patients do wander away from their homes and caregivers. Some aren't found alive. Some are never found. 5 years into the disease, we were traveling with our friend Heiner in Laos. I often woke up before Bob when we were traveling, so I'd put a note on the inside of the hotel room door saying I was out for a walk, the time I'd be back, and for Bob to wait for me in the room. I made sure the hotel card was with his belt pack, along with a card that said he had Alzheimer's, with my contact numbers and his daughter's numbers. This strategy had worked for years, giving me precious alone time away from Alz World, as I called it. But on that morning in Luang Prabang, when I returned with warm croissants for breakfast in the garden, there was no Bob. The hotel card and his belt pack lay on the desk. The staff simply said, "He go out." I tried not to panic. Heiner came along and assured me that Bob would find his way back. But after 90 minutes of waiting in the garden, we decided we better go out and search. We went into town and we rented bicycles. And just as we were about to pedal off, Bob came walking quickly towards us with a mixture of fear, frustration, and relief etched on his face. "Where have you been?" he boomed at us. We lost him 2 more times on that trip. It was apparent Bob could no longer be left alone on his own. 4 years later, I knew it was time to get my husband a retirement visa so he'd never have to leave Bali again. In order to get that visa, we needed to go to an Indonesian consulate. I chose Bangkok because we'd been there many times and it was familiar. We'd always walked at the same quick side-by-side pace, but when Alzheimer's took hold, he started following slowly behind me. I'd frequently turn to check that he was there because I knew that he could no longer make decisions. He couldn't lead. I knew he couldn't remember where we were going, why, or how we'd get there. So we had just gotten off the SkyTrain at the bustling Siam stop in Bangkok. Jostled by the thick crowd, we descended the stairs. I turned to check that he was there. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned right. But when I checked again, there was no Bob. I could feel heat rising from the bottoms of my feet to the top of my head, reddening my face. Tears of panic stung my eyes. But a voice inside said, "No, Susan, this is not the time to cry." With deep breaths, I retraced my steps. No Bob. At the bottom of the SkyTrain stairs, as I was monitoring all directions, I wondered how I'd ever find him in this city of over 8 million people. I was considering what to do next. Should I call the embassy, call the police, when a miracle happened. Bob spotted me through the crowd and came rushing over to me. I was so relieved to see him. I wasn't mad at him or at myself. I threw my arms around his neck, tears streaking down my face. He was shaking. If I'd had any doubt or been in any denial that our travel days were over, this cemented the certainty we would never travel together again. Another piece to mourn. Dealing with Alzheimer's while living in Bali is a gift, was a gift. If it hadn't have been for the caring and compassion of the Balinese, I'm not sure I could have kept Bob with me. Generally, Balinese families don't send their elderly away. Instead, they adapt around the person, keeping them within the family, doing whatever they can do to still be part of the community. They aren't afraid of pikun, the Indonesian word for senile. They accept that this is something that can happen to some of the aged. In the 9th year, I was sleep-deprived and facing burnout. I found 2 Balinese men, Nano and Ketut, to help. And while neither of them had actually ever cared for someone whose brain didn't function like theirs, they quickly caught on, inventing tricks to help manage Bob. Now, a person with Alzheimer's does not want to be treated like a child or talked down to or feel that they're being controlled, even if it is for their own good. So if Bob was about to go walk about, one of the guys would call out, "Hey, Bob, there's a cookie in the kitchen for you." Bob's sweet tooth would get the better of him. He'd turn around, and by the time he got back, he would have forgotten about both the cookie and the wandering. There's a syndrome in Alzheimer's called sundowners. And no, that doesn't mean it's cocktail hour. Instead, it's an hour of high anxiety as the sun descends in the sky. Nobody's really certain exactly why this happens, but many people wander at this time. Shadows are especially troubling. If you paint a black area on a floor, most people with Alzheimer's will step over it or go around it because they perceive it as a whole. We put in extra lights in the house and the garden and turned them on by 3, so there were fewer shadows. Bob became less anxious and happier. We also discovered that color played a role. Contrasting colors just made more sense to my husband. He had this habit of organizing cabinets and drawers, which meant we may never find some of the items again because he liked to hide them for safekeeping. Of course, he couldn't remember he had done that or where the items might be. If we didn't want him to open a door, we painted it the same color as the surrounding wall. If we did want him to open a door, we painted it a contrasting color. We painted every room in the house a different color, with the bathroom a bright yellow, so he could find it easily, since incontinence becomes a serious issue as the disease progresses. You can use the habits that the person used to have to give them a sense of security. My husband had always had a workshop full of tools, and he loved hardware stores. We found a zippered canvas bag with the word tools inscribed on it. We filled that bag with cheap, non-sharp tools that couldn't get him into trouble. There was a hammer, a tape measure, a gauge, various gaskets, nuts and bolts, pens and pencils, and other items he was familiar with. He'd spend hours taking each item out, inspecting it, and setting it aside, and then he'd put them all back in again. And sometimes he did this several times in a day. We didn't put in pliers or screwdrivers because he liked to disassemble things, like the TV. I think part of my husband's identity was tied up in his keys. He always had a hank of them in his pocket. But when he could no longer drive and we needed to keep him out of certain places for his own safety, we took a rasp to those keys, making them unusable. If one of us saw Bob trying to open a lock in frustration, we'd say, "You know, Bob, that lock's broken, but somebody's coming tomorrow to fix it." This seemed to satisfy him. We had a problem, and we were dealing with it. Of course, he'd soon forget about the broken lock until the next time, and then we would repeat the same scenario. We found that by using the same answer over and over, while completely boring to us, gave him a sense of comfort. He'd forget we had used that answer time and again, but the familiarity of it soothed him. I think one of the hardest parts for me as a caregiver was accepting on a visceral level that my husband was never going to return to my world. He now lived in Alz World. For years, I fought for him, giving him brain supplements, brain exercises, and tugging on him to keep him with me. I corrected his stories and tried to get him to see my reality when that was impossible because he only had his. Finally, and I don't know exactly when this happened, it was like I stepped through a doorway and I entered his world, bouncing back and forth between his world and mine. If he asked me how his mother was, I'd tell him what she'd been doing, when in my reality, she had died before I ever met Bob. Life definitely became easier when this crossover happened. Besides our love, I think the thing that kept me going most was humor. In the 10th year, I moved Bob into a cottage and found 2 more caregivers for a total of 4. Friend donated her dachshund, Daisy, the kind of dog that Bob grew up with. Now Bob was free to do whatever he wanted when he wanted. So if he wanted to eat an apple at 2 in the morning, the caregiver would switch on the light and just be there with him. At this time, he could no longer string words together, and I was over visiting one day when I always asked the caregivers if there was anything that Bob needed. Katuit was giving me a list, and we got off onto another tangent. Bob and I were holding hands, and then I couldn't understand anything he was saying, but I pretended I did, and we had a few laughs. And I was just about leaving, and I said, "Now, Katuit, what was it that Bob needs?" Bob said loudly and clearly, "Sex!" We chuckled over this for months because it was not only typical of his sense of humor, but it was a sign that the real Bob was in there. Another time, our friend Alan was visiting with me, and I was with the caregivers, and Alan was doing his best to engage Bob, and he indicated me, and he said in a man-to-man voice, "I think she really likes you." Bob said, making no sense at all. And then Alan said, "She takes really good care of you." Bob said something else incomprehensible. And then Alan said, "But you know, I think she's a little crazy." Bob sat right up in his wheelchair, looked straight into Alan's eyes and said, "They all are." The 4 caregivers and I took care of my husband until he passed away 2 years ago, after 14 years with Alzheimer's. They genuinely cared for my husband and made a special offering at his memorial of fruit, rice, flowers, and incense that they put in a basket to float on the water as we sprinkled his ashes in the sea. As I was letting this final piece go, I realized something. There is no final piece. Bob will always be with me in my heart. And I will always picture him, not as the man decimated by this disease, but as the strong, kind, handsome man that he was.